We are up to Daf Samaches Amid Beis. And if you recall, yesterday we had an entire discussion about Chatichas Yabeles on Shabbos, when the 14th of Nisan overlaps with Shabbos. And the issue is that if we need to get rid of this Yabeles for the sake of being machshir the carbon, because it's a mum and we have to remove the mum, are we allowed to remove that mum on Shabbos and apparently violate Meleches Gozes if he does it with an instrument? So he's using a knife. And here on Daf Samaches Amid Beis, as we studied it yesterday, we have the Pshita of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that Machshirei Mitzvah Dochem es HaShabbos, we can override Shabbos in a Malacha D'Oraisa for the sake of Machshirei Mitzvah, which is Rabbi Eliezer's Shita in Masechet Shabbos. There's a whole parak called Rabbi Eliezer the Mila, and in order to facilitate the circumcision, he's going to have to bring or sharpen or manufacture an ismol, a knife, in order to implement the circumcision. And Rabbi Eliezer says it's mutter because Mila on the 8th day is Doche Shabbos, and anything that we need for the sake of the Mila is also Doche Shabbos. So that Rabbi Eliezer would be matir Chatichas Yabeles even with a knife. But now we're holding like the Chachamim. They hold Machshir Mitzvah are not Doche Es HaShabbos, but if he does it in an unusual way, instead of using that normal instrument, that's called Kelachar Yad, and then at least we can understand Chatichas Yabeles in the Beis HaMikdash, or for the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, and we apply the principle of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. And the Gemara presented a contradiction on this issue. Our Mishnah here in Masechet Pesachim has an absolute Isur prohibiting Chatichas Yabeles on Shabbos with no strings attached. It's always Asur. And it's mashma that it's Asur even if he were to do it as a D'Rabbanan, as a Kelachar Yad, and the Shvus would still prohibit him from cutting the Abeles in that unusual way without an instrument, as opposed to the Mishnah in Erevin, which says explicitly that this case of Chatichas Yabeles depends upon Migdash and Medina. In Migdash, we apply the principle of Ein Shvutz B'Migdash. Go ahead and cut off this Yabeles. So how do we reconcile that stira between our Mishnah here and the Mishnah in Erevin? And the Gemara that we studied yesterday offered two different interpretations. So what we're up to today is Amar Rabbi Eliezer on Daf Samaches Amid Beis. Let's make sure we have the place. It's almost halfway down the Amud, or at least more than a third down the Amud, and you'll see the two dots on a line, let's say 20 lines down from the top, that starts with the word le'ashma ina. And after that, the two dots quoting the Mishnah, Omar Rabbi Eliezer, and this is the argument that Rabbi Eliezer presented to Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua had a response, and Rabbi Eliezer applied a Kal V'chomer. Ma'im Shchita, which is Malacha D'Oraisa, nevertheless, it's Doche Shabbos for the sake of the Korban Pesach, is all the others, which are only Shvus. Certainly, the Shabbos should override, or shall we say the Pesach should override the Shabbos. So Rabbi Yeshua, you may recall, again, this we did a couple of, like almost a week ago, he was of the opinion that let's take a case of Yontif. On Yontif, the Torah allows you to do Malacha D'Oraisa for Ochel Nefesh. However, there are many things that are also on Yontif, even if is for the purpose of Ochel Nefesh. So let's say, for example, he's got to bring food from yonder, outside of the Tchum, and there's an Isa Tchum D'Rabbanan on Yontif as well. We're not going to allow him to bring food from outside of the Tchum on Yontif for the purpose of eating it on Yontif. What happened to your Kal V'chomer, Rabbi Eliezer? You're telling me that if you're allowed a Malacha Doraisa for the sake of, let's say, in the case of Korban Pesach, the Shabbos, that Korban Pesach overrides the Shabbos, or a Malacha Doraisa of preparing food through Bishul, Shchita, on Yontif, this is all mutter, then Kal V'chomer, we should certainly allow a Shvus, a D'Rabbanan. And in the case of Yontif, we're talking about Chutz Tchum. Rabbi Yeshua attacks Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, according to your logic, we should be allowed to bring food in on Yontif from Chutz Tchum. Because if we're matir a Malacha Doraisa for the sake of Ochel Nefesh, how much more so should be matir Shvus, a D'Rabbanan like Chutz Tchum. So Rabbi Eliezer, the ball is now in his court. He counters against Rabbi Yeshua's counter against him. And he says, wait a minute. I only said this in the case of Lidvar Mitzvah. So for example, in the case of Korban Pesach, for the sake of the Mitzvah of Korban Pesach, we will override a Malacha Dorais of Shechita. How much on Shabbos? How much more so will we override a Shvus, like carrying the lamb from Chutz Tchum? But you're giving me a proof from bringing food on Yontif Chutz Tchum? When you want to bring food on Yontif Chutz Tchum, that's very nice. But it's a Dvar Rishus, it's not a Dvar Mitzvah. The Torah doesn't command you to bring this food on Yontif. If the food is here, the Torah allows you to cook it. Let's say it's raw food, Ochel Nefesh. But to violate even an Isa D'Rabbanan, because you're in the mood to eat, I don't know what, you want Yedem's cholent that's outside the Tchum on Yontif, that's a Varishus. So the Gemara now wants to clarify why Rabbi Yeshua thought that he had checkmated Rabbi Eliezer, why Rabbi Eliezer thought that it's no proof. Rabbi Yeshua l'tamei diomar simchas yontif nami mitvahi. Interesting. Rabbi Yeshua, as we'll see, is very consistent with his opinion that eating on yontif is a mitzvah of simcha. So when he says, I want this cholent on yontif, that's l'shem mitzvah. And yet we're not going to allow. However, Rabbi Eliezer, he holds that eating and drinking on Yontif, you go ahead and eat and drink on Yontif, but that's not a mitzvah of simcha. That's a dvar rishus. Now again, if according to Rabbi Yeshua, eating and drinking on Yontif is a dvar mitzvah, and you fulfill the mitzvah of samachta b'chagecha, then Rabbi Yeshua is asking Rabbi Eliezer, again based on Rabbi Yeshua's premise, well, why aren't we matir bringing the food from Chutz Tchum for the sake of the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif? Will really enhance our Simchas Yontif by bringing this cholent from yonder, from the next village over. And the only reason why we won't do so is because you could have done it yesterday. And anything that you could have done yesterday, we're not going to allow you to do today. So although this violation would only be a D'Rabbanan of a Shvus because of Chutz L'Tchum, but we're not going to allow you to violate a Chutz L'Tchum Shvus when you could have done it yesterday. So the Torah will allow you to cook fresh food for Yontif. The Torah will allow you to shecht an animal so that the meat be fresh. But you're talking about food that could have been brought yesterday and you want to transport it today, chutz l'tchum, that we're not going to allow. And the same thing should apply to the lamb for a Korban Pesach. Surely, if the lamb is here in the Azara and we have to shecht it as part of Korban Pesach or whatever malachos we have to do, that's one thing. But to say you're going to bring the lamb from chutz l'tchum, because otherwise you have no lamb for the Korban Pesach, then we're going to say to you, no. Why didn't you do this yesterday? And therefore, this whole Kal Vachomer of Rabbi Eliezer falls to pieces. Rabbi Eliezer is saying, well, if the Torah is Matir Doraisa, full-fledged Malacha, it's also a Shvus, yeah, but that's a problem because the Malacha Doraisa is necessary. If you don't check the Korban Pesach today, you don't have a mitzvah of Korban Pesach. But why didn't you bring the lamb yesterday in order to have the Korban Pesach today? To Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein lo li adam b'yontif ela o ochel v'shoseh o yoshev v'shoneh. The Gemara quotes a brisa, and the brisa is trying to reconcile two psukim that at the face of it contradict each other. On the one hand, the Torah says Atzeres Lashem, and on the other hand, the Torah says Atzeres Lachem. And Lashem means Torah and Tefillah, and Lachem means Achila and Shasiyah. So what is it? How does one observe Yontif? Should it be Lachem, or should it be Lashem? Says Rabbi Eliezer, Ein lo li adam b'yontif ela o ochel v'shoseh o yoshev v'shoneh. I don't understand one thing here. Rabbi Eliezer gives you an option of ochel v'shoseh because the Torah does use the word lachem, correct? It says atzeres tia lachem in the parsha of Shmini Atzeres. So if it's atzeres tia lachem, if achil and shasiyah is an option. Why does the Gemara assume that there's no mitzvah of Simchas Yontif? Just 1 second. One second, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't, in my mathematics here, I missed a point, which really bothers my mind now. All I can tell you is the following. Again, this needs a lot more work to, polish the edges here, but Rabbi Eliezer understands that Atzeres Tia Lachem is an option. The Torah is allowing you to dismiss or ignore Atzeres Hi Lashem in favor of Atzeres Hi Lachem. And that's the way you'll experience Yontif, but it's not a mitzvah. So that any violation of a shvus for the purpose of achila and shasiyah, according to Rabbi Eliezer, would be prohibited because it's not l'shem mitzvah. And lachem, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is a matir, but not a mitzvah. It's not a chov or a kiyum. It's just a head. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, the Torah is telling me in these two psukim exactly how to observe Yontif. And we're talking now about the chiyuv of how to experience Yontif. Chalkeu chetzia lachila ushsia v'chetzia lebeis hamedrash. In other words, according to Rabbi Yeshua, achila on Yontif is a mitzvah, whereas according to Rabbi Eliezer, achila on Yontif is only a reshus. In other words, you can get away without achila and shasi according to Rabbi Eliezer. You could be yoshev v'lomed and be kovea lashem, and you'll be makayim the mitzvah of Yontif. So when the Torah says that achasher yochel lenefesh hu yasel lachem, the Torah's matir achilas, meleches ochel nefesh, that's a heter. For the sake of ochel nefesh, which is mutar on Yontif, will allow you to do malach. But don't tell me that malacha is l'tzorach mitzvah. Mashen can according to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua say no way, no how. There's no way you could observe Yontif without achil and shasiyah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan shneim mikra echad darshu. They both tried to reconcile an apparent contradiction of two psukim. Kosav echad omer atzeres lashem elokecha. The kosav echad omer atzeres ti elochem. So twice the Torah goes through the Seder HaMoadim. Once the Torah does it at the end of Bamidbar when it's going through the Karbanos. And the Torah repeats the Seder of the Regalim in Parshas Re'eh. But whereas in Bamidbar it says Lachem, in Sefer Dvarim it says Lashem. So how do we reconcile this? Rabbi Eliezer, Savar, Okul Hashem, Okul Lachem. You have two options. You can dedicate the day to limud and to davening, to tefillah, or you can dedicate the day to achila and shasiyah. And if you might ask the question, why dedicate your day to learning? So the Mefarshim say over here, I have a note that Pekudi Hashem Yishar V'Samchi Lev, that when we learn Torah, we're in a state of simcha, and that's the way you could observe Yontif as a simcha day through the study of Torah. But it comes out that there's no chiyuv of lachem, of achil and shasiyah. There's no absolute obligation of that sort. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer would agree that we cannot override even a shvus d'Rabbanan to facilitate achil and shasiyah on Yontif because it's not necessary. You have another option. The Torah says, "Atzeres Lashem Elokecha." Rabbi Yeshua Savar Chalkeu Chetzil Hashem v'Chetzil Lachem. In other words, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the pasuk of Lachem is an absolute, unconditional requirement, and that's the way you fulfill the mitzvah of Yontif. You cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Yontif without Chetzil Lachem. And therefore, any food that you import from Chutz L'Tchum is for the sake of a mitzvah, and yet we're going to prohibit it because you could have done it on Erev Yontif. So that again, just to reiterate, Whereas Rabbi Yeshua says that you're absolutely unconditionally obligated to eat and drink on Yontif because of the pasuk lachem, and therefore Rabbi Yeshua has a great pircha on Rabbi Eliezer's kavachomer. What was your kavachomer, Rabbi Eliezer? If you're going to be matir malacha of afia, bishul, shchita, and so forth on Yontif for ochel nefesh, how much more so should we be matir bringing food chutz l'tchum? That was Rabbi Eliezer's argument. So Rabbi Yeshua says to him, well, what do you mean? We're not going to allow you to bring food chutz l'tchum on Yontif. What happened to your kal v'chomer? So Rabbi Eliezer is going to answer, well, bringing food chutz l'tchum is a dvar rishus. It's not a dvar mitzvah. And that we're not going to allow. We're going to tell you to take care of all the dvar rishus on Erev Yontif. But Rabbi Yeshua l'shitasu says, no, it's an excellent proof because these two cases parallel each other to the same extent that I want to bring a lamb chutz l'tchum for the purpose of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and yet it's prohibited because he could have done it yesterday. So too, if I want to bring my food for Yontif meal, chutz l'tchum, it's going to be prohibited. And in both cases, it's l'tzarech mitzvah because Rabbi Yeshua holds that chetzia lachem is a requirement. Achil and shsia is obligatory. Now, once the Gemara gets into this discussion about how we fulfill Yontif, the Gemara already expands. Amar Rabbi Elazar, hakol modim batzeres to be inon nami lachem. Again, this is not Rabbi Eliezer the Tana, this is Rabbi Elazar the Amora. He says everybody would agree that when it comes to Chag HaShavuos, we're required to eat and drink on Chag HaShavuos. Why? My time at Yom Shenitna Bo Torah. Okay, it's Yom Shenitna Bo Torah, that's Shavuos, but therefore you have to eat and drink on Shavuos. Get your piece of cheesecake. I don't get it. I would have said just the opposite. The logic demands that on Yom Shenitna Bo Torah, which is all about ruchaniyut and spirituality, that's the day we should dedicate to Limud Torah. No, it doesn't make sense. On the day that we receive the Torah, we should dedicate ourselves to Limud Torah. And I call motiv atzeres to be in a nami lachem. You got to eat and drink. A festive meal. Again, if you like blintzes, so you'll eat cheese blintzes. So here we have the Achronim want to explain what this is all about. He has a sefer called the Eshel Avraham. Once I knew who the author was, but anyway, he says the following. The Gemara tells us in the famous Agadita of Shabbos Peiches that the Malachi Ashorei subjected to bringing the Torah down to this world. Leave it up in Shemayim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepted the argument of Moshe Rabbeinu that the Torah is appropriate for Basar V'Dam. In other words, the Torah tells us to live in a disciplined way with regard to our physical components of our reality, material physicality. And that's the advantage of human beings over malachim. So if you want to dedicate yourself on Shavuos to sitting and learning Torah and completely ignore the physicality and the pleasures of eating, then you're basically falling prey to the arguments of the malachim. Leave the Torah up in Shemayim. We know how to live a pure spiritual life that's completely, disconnected to physicality. So leave the Torah up here. So we have to get involved in physical eating and drinking on Chag HaShavuos in order to prove to the malachim that the Torah belongs down here on earth, because we can take the physicality and we can elevate it to the spiritual level. That's why we get to we receive the Torah. Now I have a note here. He says that this chiyuv is not derived from a pasuk, but rather it's a mitzvah midivrei chachamim k'dei laharos shesomeach b'matan Torah. That he quotes in the name of a Talmud of the Ramban, the Rabbeinu David. And if this be the case, maybe we can answer the following question. Why is it, Madula Ochiach Rabbi Yeshua Sadin, she'aso lasa shvus b'malachos and etzrochos ha'krovos ha'pesach mi'itza shvus b'chag ha'shvuos. So Chorei Rabbi Eliezer Modesh Achili Mitzvah Lo Rishus El Shlo Nitan Lo Chiyah Mitzvus Me'achar Shedino Nilma Mitzvah V'Lo Mipos. In other words, if Hakol Modim, which means that even Rabbi Eliezer will agree that on Shavuos there's a mitzvah and a chova of achilas, basar, and yayin, then why didn't Rabbi Yeshua quote the case of Chag HaShavuos to undermine the kavachomer of Rabbi Eliezer? Here, on Shavuos, are you going to allow me to bring food and drink from Chutz L'Tchum for the sake of Achil and Shasiya on Yontif? And the answer is no, we're not going to allow that. That's L'Dvar Mitzvah, because even you agree it's L'Dvar Mitzvah. The answer is, based on this Rabbeinu David, it's not a mitzvah in the Torah, it's a mitzvah that the Chachamim molded or designed in order to express our simcha for the Torah being given to us. Omar Rabba, Kol Modim Shabbos to be Inanami Lachem. Do you remember this Gemara? I don't remember this Gemara, that on Shabbos we need Lachem. Where does it say Lachem on Shabbos? Yeah, Atzeres Tia Lachem. On my timer says the Gemara, Pasuk at the end of Yeshaya, the Karasol Shabbos Oneg. You have to be adding the Shabbos by eating and drinking. And once again, we're going to have to apply the same logic that, based on Rabbeinu David, we're not talking about a mitzvah da'oraisa that's explicit in the Torah, that on Shabbos you must eat and drink. Because once again, we're going to ask the Kasha of Yeshua from Shabbos, why don't we allow on Shabbos bringing food and drink from Chutz L'Tchum? But rather, it's something that we derive from Divrei Kabbalah, which means a pasuk in Tanakh, in this case, Yeshaya Perek Nun Ches. And the pasuk says, "V'karasel Shabbos Oneg," and therefore we have a mitzvah of Achila and Shasiya on Shabbos. Now, are you allowed to fast on Shabbos? So this becomes a sugya called Tainis Chalom, which is going to come up here in our Gemara. I don't know if we'll get to it today. I'll just finish up. Omer Rav Yosef Hakol Modim Bepurim de Beina Nami Lochem. On Purim, you can't fast, even if you're in the mood to fast. Now, why is that? My timer, you may mishteh v'simcha ksivbe. You have to underline the word mishteh. But simcha, you might be able to achieve by fasting. If, let's say, you had a bad dream, and your oneg is to fast. But mishteh is a separate, independent mitzvah of achila and chasiya. The Torah requires that on Purim we have achila and chasiya. So you can debate whether or not on Pesach or let's say on Sukkot I have to eat or I have to drink. And I'll tell you, I'd rather fast. That could be a serious question, and I would say you're allowed to fast, according to Rabbi Eliezer for sure. However, on Purim, no go. No fasting on Purim. Erev Purim will fast. That's called Titus Esther. I don't know about this year, but anyway. Fine. Mar Dreid Ravina, Kula Shaita Havi Yosef B'Tanisa. He fasted. He had that, what we call the Shita of Prisha. You may recall in history there were the Chachmei Ashkenaz. They believed and advocated in Prisha, like as if to say, This world is not given to any pleasures whatsoever. So they would fast and fast. And this Marbrei Ravina fit that profile. He was a faster. But Labar Me'atzarta Purim Alid Yom Kippur. There were 3 days out of the Hebrew calendar year when he didn't fast. Again, at night he would eat, right? It was a Gansior Ramadan for Marbrei Ravina, but not on Shavuos, because Hakol Moed B'Shavuos to be in Nami Lachem, Yom Shenit Torah. Not on Purim, because Torah calls it Yom Nushte. And not on Erev Yom Kippur, because the Torah says, B'nisam es nafshel seichem b'tshi, on the 9th, which is a reference to the mitzvah of Achil. So he says the following: Atzeres Yom Shenit Lebel Torah Puria Yemei Mishta V'Simcha Ksiv Mali Yom Adikipura Detoni Chiyah Bar Rav Difti B'nisam es nafshel seichem b'tisha b'chodesh. What does that mean that you should afflict on the 9th of Tishrei? Balo Basiri Misanin. There's no Chalos Yom Kippur on the 9th. Elo Lomel Chakalocha V'Shosa B'Tisha Malo Lovakosa Kilu Misane Shi Ve'asiri. That if a person eats on Erev Yom Kippur, it's considered like he fasted on both the 9th and the 10th of Tishrei. So we see that on Erev Yom Kippur there's a separate mitzvah of Achila and Shasiya. The reason for this mitzvah might be because it gives him strength to fast on Yom Kippur, or might be a different mitzvah. That the 9th itself is, so to speak, a mitzvah yontiv, and there's a mitzvah achil and shasir. But in these 3 cases of Atzeres and Purim and Erev Yom Kippur, even if your pleasure in life is fasting, or for example, you had a bad dream and you claim that your oneg is to fast, you'd be in a better psychological state of simcha if you fasted than if you ate the most glorious 7-course meal. Not on these 3 days. But these are the 3 days where the mitzvah of Achila and Shasiya is a separate independent mitzvah. It's not a conduit, a means to an end of oneg. If it's only a means to an end, like for example on Pesach or on Sukkot, we eat and we drink in order to bring ourselves to a state of simcha, then you have a right to say, I had a bad dream last night, my simcha is, my oneg is to abstain from eating. But when it comes to these 3 days, this is not a mitzvah of oneg. This is a mitzvah of mishta. This is a mitzvah of inui, of chi for asiri. And there's a separate mitzvah of Yom Shemitah B'Torah of Achila and Shasiya. When there's a separate independent mitzvah of Achila and Shasiya, you have no right to say, well, my oneg is to fast. And therefore, even Marbrei Ravina would, although he would fast the whole year round, that was his oneg. So on Sukkot and on Pesach, on Shabbos, he would fast. But not on these 3 days where there's a separate, as we say in Yiddish, a besundere mitzvah of Achila. Okay then? So let's just make a note. If anyone has some questions, now's a good time to ask. But we'll make a note of where we got up to for tomorrow. And we're up to Rav Yosef Biyoma Diatzarta. And that's about, I would say, about 10 lines up before the end of the Amud. And then everyone should have a wonderful day. And thank you so much.